Ladies and gentlemen, today is October 27th, 2024, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
Doing pretty well, yourself?
Doing okay. Can't complain.
Good. Keeping it real, despite our BG3 run's current situation. A little bit split in half recently committing crimes, which escalated in their intensity very quickly.
A little unexpected.
There was a minor lifting of a key from a pocket, but I forgot. My character is a plate-wearing class. I can't play it like a Dex hero. The problem is, you can hide armor in BG3 to show your character's like normal clothing, and the character that I have is a tiefling lady character, and if she's showing her clothing and not her armor, she looks more like a Dex hero than like a strength hero. So if you have huge, heavy, clanky iron armor, people are gonna notice if you try to sneak up behind them. So I got caught, and then the police showed up, and shots were fired. We have non-lethal toggled on, but a lot of AoE stuff has killed, unfortunately, several people. So that's going to be a mess that we'll clean up later this evening.
We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I didn't touch it at all, so the run is where we left it off. I think you and one of the other characters are still in the basement, and then me and one of the characters is back at camp outside.
Yeah, correct.
So, yeah.
We'll try to sneak them out.
Well, how was this week? Last week we got to talk to Bitter Sugar about Ukraine and hear his perspective. And it was actually an amazing and enlightening conversation where I think we both learned a bunch of stuff that we wouldn't have thought to ask about. Like the whole conversation about what language he speaks in and thinks in and studies in, and how a lot of Soviet traditions are still ingrained in their society. And people of his generation are aware of when that's happening and a lot of those different corrupt practices, and they know that they're working on it. So it's a heckin' mess. It was really cool to have a first-hand perspective because it's so different from what you read in articles, because you have the human emotion behind it and you have a real storyline that's happening, which is great for humanizing situations like this, where when a war is really far from you, a lot of it gets broken down in statistics of how many casualties were there, this kind of thing, where a human is more than just a statistic and a casualty. They've got everything they believe in, and what the person believes has a huge bearing on how the culture is moving, what the people are talking about, what's possible for them to change, and what they're motivated to change. But it was really awesome, and I think we got through, you said, half of your questions, so we will do a follow-up. It was just like 3 a.m., and I had to get up the next morning, and I was like, this is amazing, but good night.
No, I appreciate you staying up as long as you did. You didn't have to, so full credit.
Yeah, all good. We have to bridge a time gap from West Coast U.S. for me, and he's in Ukraine, so check that one out. It is on YouTube.
One of the disadvantages of being on the American continent. You're kind of isolated from most of the world, time-wise, so it can be a little awkward.
Yeah, but Australia, they have it even worse, so can't complain. I feel so bad because there's so much passion from like Australian gamers and things like that, but to be able to find matches, there are oftentimes like at a high level, maybe only one or two more people who can really be a good challenge for you, say in StarCraft. Otherwise, you have to play from across an ocean, which has a lot of lag to it. So Australia is far from everybody. They're almost their own planet. They might even get classified as one. That's really cool.
Well, they are in roughly the same time zone as China, so they could easily address those problems by taking up Chinese gaming.
That's true. It would make communication somewhat harder, but the ping would be lower.
Much more so.
Doesn't China have like a bunch of weird stuff of you can't like drive your internet cables through their waters or something?
I don't know about that. Like they're connected to the underwater network, although the U.S. government did scupper an attempt to connect it to the Philippines, so that didn't help much. But as far as I know, they are connected, so it shouldn't be that hard. And the Great Firewall doesn't filter, as far as I know, incoming traffic in the same way that it does outgoing traffic. So you can totally use a lot of Chinese applications and stuff. WeChat, Baidu Maps is actually pretty cool. I don't know if you've heard of that, but Google Maps can't get like their cars into China so that they can map it out like they did here in the US and much of the rest of the world. So you don't have Google Street View in China. But Baidu actually has their own version of Google Maps called Baidu Maps, and they actually have Street View on their website. So if you've ever wanted to like do a Street View exploration of China, like what you can do in Google Maps, you can do that in Baidu. Yeah, it's actually pretty fun. I was using it to do some research on the Second Sino-Japanese War. Pretty useful. But yeah, I didn't have any problems using it. So I would imagine that if you're in the same roughly area of China, Southeast Asia, Australia, you should be able to play on the same server as the Chinese gamers. Maybe somebody more familiar with the topic would know, but I would assume you could. I just don't think Chinese games are that popular outside of China generally, with a handful of exceptions. Yeah, I noticed Saudi Arabia had like this big international competition for gaming. It was like a gaming Olympics almost.
EWC. Yeah.
Is that what it was?
It was massive. Yeah. Ended up being, I think was it the Grand Championship for StarCraft 2? Maybe not. But it was one of the like major premier events, and it's breathed a lot of new money into StarCraft esports and has carried a lot of stuff. Like I think Saudi Arabia also sponsors ESL, that whole circuit for StarCraft stuff. So yeah, pretty interesting seeing this round of the life cycle and who picked up the torch. Would not have guessed that, but...
Well, I looked into it just to see what games they had at the competition, and I noticed that I didn't recognize a lot of them. And it turned out that a lot of them were just games that were popular in China for the most part. And their user base is mostly East Asian, if not Chinese specifically. I think there was one that was actually Southeast Asian that I'd never heard of before.
Indonesia has a pretty big gaming scene.
Well, I'd never heard that, but it makes sense given how many people they have.
What's there's another country down there that's really strong in Dota. Maybe Chad knows.
Dota.
It's not part of Asia, but Peru is another country that is surprisingly represented in esports.
Really?
Yeah. A lot of America's server players, like where I play, have a prejudice against them. There's a bit of a communication barrier, so it can be frustrating to be on a team with people who speak Spanish and you speak English, and it's hard to steer in the right direction.
So Peru and a mystery meat country in Southeast Asia are dominant in Dota.
Yes. Philippines, says Chad.
Ah, Philippines. Okay, yeah, that kind of makes sense. That's a weird country, the Philippines.
Yeah, it has a lot more American influence, I think, right?
Spanish and American influence, yeah. Kind of mixed together. It's an odd combination. And it's very different than pretty much any other country in the region. Because you've got like the Muslim countries like Indonesia and Malaysia. And then you've got like the Buddhist area like Vietnam and Thailand. And of course, there's a big Chinese minority in Malaysia and a Chinese majority in Singapore. And then you've got communism in Vietnam and Laos. And, so you've kind of got like three general cultural areas, right? Sort of the Sinitic area in the north, sort of the Buddhist area in the west with Burma and Thailand, and then sort of more of a Muslim South. And then, bam, you've got like this Catholic Spanish American country. It's just off to the side.
Mm-hmm.
It's very unique in that regard. Yeah, they just kind of do their own thing. Yeah, I think the American influence is probably more in terms of language and politics, like the structure of the government. In terms of actual culture, Spanish influence is probably stronger. You know, obviously they have their own native culture, right? Sort of the indigenous Melanesian culture. Hope I'm getting that right. You know, that's still there, but the Spanish influence is also very strong. They were there for several centuries, so they had a lot of opportunities to influence the customs of the country and the people therein. So by the time the Americans got there, Spanish influence was pretty well ingrained. And the United States wasn't there all that long. You know, it was the U.S. got it in the Spanish-American War, which was 1896, I want to say. And then the U.S. withdrew from the Philippines and gave it its independence in 1948, I think. So it's only about 50 years the United States was there, much less than the Spanish. You know, again, the Spanish were there from mid-1500s. So like, 200, 300, about 400 years of Spanish colonialism there. So that's a long time. They had plenty of time to work over the culture there. But yeah, I would say, and also actually Mexican influence, because a lot of the Spanish that came to the Philippines, either as traders or even as just, you know, migrants, actually came from Mexico rather than Spain
Really?
itself.
Huh.
Yeah, like the governors were from Spain. You know, they were the Peninsulars, but like a lot of the other people kind of had stronger ties to Mexico. So there's actually kind of this weird friendship, you know, the cultural affinity between Mexico and the Philippines.
I did not know that.
And that's not even getting into the Muslim areas of the Philippines and the far south, or all of the linguistic diversity. There's a whole bunch of different languages in the Philippines.
Well, if there's anything that I know, it's that there is Muslim influence in Thailand because they have Muslim curry, which is an amazing kind of food and should be respected. How do you know that there is Muslim influence in Thailand? Well, let me tell you about this yellow curry. They put potatoes and carrots in it, and it's genius.
I think that's the far south of Thailand. That's where they have most of their Muslim population. Not any considerable violence there stemming from that. You know, the Muslim population in the far south is more ethnically Malay, you know, like the native population of Malaysia. And so they're ethnically distinct from the ethnic Thai population that's dominant in Thailand. So there's some separatist inclination among some quarters in the far south of Thailand. And there's been a couple of separatist groups that have gotten violent over the past half century or so. It's never broken out into like a full rebellion, but there's been an off and on low intensity conflict in the area. So, you know, occasionally some terrorism, maybe a hit and run attack of some kind, you know, that kind of stuff.
What are they terrorizing about? What do they want?
They want independence, you know, or at least more autonomy for their region within Thailand. Or maybe even to join with Malaysia. I'm sure there's different opinions on that. Yeah, basically separatists. They think they'd be better off on their own.
Could see that. Well, what's been going on this week?
Actually, we haven't really done this in 3 weeks because we had bitter sugar last time, and then before that, we thought we were going to have bitter sugar, but didn't, so we just ended up playing Baldur's Gate
Oh,
for like
yeah.
3 hours, which was a lot of fun. But it meant we didn't cover that week. And then the week before that, I think there was just the week before that. So, in total, it's been a while. So there's kind of been an accumulation of stuff. None of it necessarily stands out too much. I don't think we really missed anything too dramatic. But there are some items of interest we can get into. But was there anything in particular you wanted to talk about?
I don't think so. I voted this week. It's vote by mail in California. It's very easy to do. Chat, go vote. Think for yourself. One thing that you should do, don't be apathetic and be like, my vote's not going to matter. I'm in a red state or blue state, and it's the same as what I would vote anyway. No, just go do it. It's a good habit to get into. A big part of why older people have more power in politics is because they actually go vote. So if you can just do that, then you represent the younger generation and what we're about, like understanding our memes and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, go vote. I voted. It's also a personal thing, so you don't need to tell people who you voted for, and I don't care. Love you, chat. People vote with their conscience, or they vote by who has successfully rolled a charisma check against you, and you can't resist them, so that's fine too. But we live in a very confusing modern world, and we're all trying our best to understand things, so yeah. Do your part and vote, if you can, and have the means to do so. There were also a bunch of referendums and stuff that you vote on. California had a bunch of different questions of like, do we want to sponsor this new thing? So that was cool.
Look that up. Yeah, if you're interested in figuring out what's going to be on your ballot, there's a website called Ballotpedia, which will actually show it to you, so you can get an easy reference to look into all the different people running and do your research and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
I've been meaning to do that, but I've been lazy. I've had stuff distracting me, Factorio principle among them. So much stuff to build in Neuro.
True. So much to build, so little time.
Oh, have you ever heard of Suno?
Suno? Is it a game?
No, it's actually a website. What it does is it creates AI generated songs based off of prompts you feed into it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's actually pretty effective. Some of the lyrics don't make a lot of sense, but in terms of the actual music quality, it's surprisingly decent. They did a pretty good job with it. So if you ever want a homebrew song about just whatever random bullshit you can think of, give it a try. If nothing else, you'll find the results entertaining.
Mm.
I've been feeding a bunch of like historical prompts, like the years of lead in Italy. What was it? It was like a rock song about the years of lead.
Huh.
Just a whole bunch of stuff.
Weird. Yeah, I haven't really gotten into AI generated music. I have done AI generated images. And my generations kind of get stuck in the rut of the same archetype of character, so. But it's pretty cool. Robots trying to take averages. It's basically just taking an average of a category. You throw it tags and you say, of the stuff that hit these tags, throw all of it, put it into a blender, and then give me the result. And sometimes it creates a horrid nightmare of something that's really eerie and hits the uncanny valley really hard, like a ton of bricks. And you're like, good night, I've created a cursed horror upon the cosmos, and you have to destroy it. But yeah, sometimes it actually does pretty well. One thing that I used for the D&D one-shot that I hosted was just making some like beach nature backgrounds for the tropical D&D session that I was trying to create an image of, and I didn't want to like take someone else's photograph, so it seemed like the nicer thing to do. But it technically is looking at other art that has the same tags as what you're feeding into it. It's pretty interesting.
There's a lot of debate about that behind the scenes from the kind of people who create the content that's used in the that's used as input.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you have you heard of that.
No.
I think it's more prominent in like the artistic community. You know, people who normally would get a commission to produce some kind of like a picture, a portrait, whatever. Their stuff that they make gets aggregated together and processed by AI algorithms to produce new art. But the problem is that some of the work they would normally get instead goes towards the people who made the AI algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
But that's controversial because they're then not compensated for the input that went into the algorithm. So they're losing work to an algorithm that is basically taking their stuff.
Yeah.
And they think they should be compensated for that, or that people shouldn't use it until they are compensated, to some degree, or just don't use it at all and just use the traditional commission process for individual artists.
Yeah, to me, the ideal way to navigate that would be similar to revenue sharing that YouTube does, where it recognizes that your art was referenced for this other art, so you should get a piece of the pie. If it worked that way, that would be pretty cool, but currently it is not. It's just if your stuff is on the internet and publicly scrubbable, then the bots will find it and they'll mush it into their art blender.
Yeah, therein lies the rub. Let's see, I think the biggest single item that I would reference here is that Israel did finally retaliate to Iran's retaliation to Israel invading southern Lebanon. That had kind of been in the cards for a week or two, but nobody was sure what would happen. So finally, I think this past Saturday, Israel actually did bomb Iran.
Mm-hmm.
Relatively limited in scope. It seems they mostly just targeted factories that produce ballistic missiles, which was the main type of missile. Well, the only type of missile that Iran used to bombard Israel in response to the Israeli incursion into Lebanon. So that's, why they did that is the subject of some debate, because, it makes sense strategically, but the Israelis probably wanted to do more, and the opposition in Israel has actually been criticizing Netanyahu for not doing more. So the question is, did American pressure result in the Israelis narrowing the scope of their retaliation, or are they signaling here that they just don't want a further tit-for-tat escalation with Iran? Because the Iranian government had been saying that if the Israelis did anything, then they would hit back even harder than they did last time. But given the relatively narrow scope of this attack, the Iranian government has kind of been downplaying it. They've said that they mostly defeated the attack and it's not a big deal. And so there hasn't been the same amount of noise about some kind of further escalation. So, the early signs here are that this is going to be it, until the next bullshit thing happens that requires more performative violence. It seems like they're not going to allow this to be the cascade that goes into a uncontrollable tit-for-tat series of escalations. So this one's under control and seems to be done with. But we'll see how long that lasts. Generally hasn't taken too long. A couple of months, probably before the next thing. Yeah, there were 4 Iranian soldiers that died in the Israeli strike. And from what I read, even people in Iran who were opposed to the government were not very happy about that. Yeah, the speaker that I heard stated that there's actually relatively more sympathy in Iran for Israel than in other countries in the region. Keep in mind that one of the principal catalysts for anti-Israeli opinion in the Middle East is actually pan-Arab nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
But Iran is not an Arab country, so there's not really the same degree of sympathy with the Palestinians that you would see in other areas that are predominantly Arab. So there is, some degree of sympathy for Israel, and of course significant, criticism of the Iranian government, but having the 4 soldiers die in the attack has kind of put off a lot of people who might otherwise be sympathetic. So tactically and strategically, it was a win for Israel, but diplomatically and politically, this might have set them back a bit. We'll see. They haven't suffered too much from the series of escalations that have happened since the October attack last year. So, the Israeli government probably thinks it's doing pretty well and doesn't see any reason to hold back. So they'll probably continue the wars at this point, plural, in Lebanon and Gaza apace. There's just not really much, or at least not enough pushback right now for them to reconsider either operation. So status quo ante, effectively, for all of the drama. That seems to be the one persistent thing. Let's see, what else did we have? I guess since we're on Israel, some of the stuff we didn't cover over the past couple weeks. There was an incident where some UN forces were injured by the IDF. Hezbollah has been kind of going out of its way to locate its forces near UN positions. Mind you, the UN has forces on the ground because of the peace agreement that was, or at least the ceasefire agreement that was agreed between Hezbollah and Israel in 2006, which was the last time they fought a big conflict. Part of that agreement involved UN forces being deployed to the border region between southern Lebanon and Israel to ensure that both Hezbollah and Israel respected the provisions of the ceasefire agreement, which involved both sides withdrawing a certain distance from the border. Hezbollah basically just ignored that after the fact. It's not really surprising anybody, but the UN forces remained anyway, to continue to monitor the situation and whatnot. And after the recent hostilities broke out, the UN forces remained still. And Hezbollah has been kind of sneaking some forces close to their positions, basically because they want to kind of increase the risk of some kind of incident involving the UN. And the Israelis, for their part, have actually asked the UN to just leave entirely because, at this point, they're not doing anything. It's kind of pointless. But the UN insists that they still have a mandate to be there and are refusing to leave, and so it's kind of turned into a diplomatic kerfuffle. So the Israelis, for their part, specifically a particular IDF unit, apparently went so far at one point, going after Hezbollah units located near a UN position, sent tanks through the UN position's front gate, looking for Hezbollah, basically. And that even got governments that are allied with Israel kind of complaining about that. They actually condemned the Israeli government for violating the UN position in that way. So I don't think it really matters in the grand scheme of things, but it just illustrates how much pressure the Israeli government and military are heaping on Hezbollah here. There's really not a lot of guardrails left that are protecting Hezbollah. So let's see, that's Lebanon. As for Gaza, there's been talk about something called the General's Plan. I don't remember the specific general's name, the specific name of the general in question, but he came up with a plan way back last year when the conflict was still pretty new, in which he said that the way to fight Hamas would be to force out the entire civilian population of northern Gaza, force all of the civilians to leave northern Gaza, and then basically declare it a free fire zone. The implicit assumption being that anybody left after the civilians are gone must be combatants fighting for Gaza. So that being the case, they would be able to significantly reduce all of the different guardrails they have for their operations. They can just focus purely on kinetic operations and not worry about trying to preserve life or mitigate civilian casualties. The assumption would be at that point that there wouldn't be any civilians to worry about. And so the thinking was that would be an easier way and more effective way to attrit Hamas's forces and eventually defeat them. Now, obviously, the plan has flaws, that being that Hamas could always just go with the civilians. If you're a insurgent group, you can blend into the civilian population. That's Mao's old dictum. An insurgent, or I guess rebel's job, or revolutionary's job, is to kind of swim with the people like a fish swims in the sea. Something to that effect. I don't remember the specific quote. But the idea is that you can blend in with the civilian population, thereby making it difficult for an oppressor or occupying force or a military, or however you want to frame that. You can make it difficult for them to figure out who's who and to actually cripple your organization. So the general's plan is tactically proficient. It makes sense at that level, but strategically, it probably would not be that effective. And in that vein, it's very similar to traditional counterinsurgency operations practiced by Western militaries. The history of Western militaries trying to fight insurgencies is not very good. Certainly not over the past 50 years anyway. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan being particular standouts, and of course Israeli operations in Lebanon in the 1980s, and then again now in Gaza. Even some IDF commanders are complaining now that there really needs to be an overarching strategic and political plan for Gaza that goes beyond just the tactical plan of fighting Hamas, because they're having to return to areas in Gaza that they had previously cleared of Hamas multiple times. And that suggests that the war isn't anywhere near over, right? It's basically just self-sustaining at this point. Anyway, that's a long tangent to kind of get us where we are now, which is that it seems like the Israeli military might actually be implementing the general's plan. They had not done it before because there were concerns on humanitarian grounds, and, aggravating the American government, aggravating international opinion, and also they kind of thought that they could deal with Hamas without going to such extremes. But now there has been more emphasis on trying to not only clear northern Gaza, but also to prevent civilians from returning to their homes. And the thinking is also there's been a tightening of humanitarian aid going into northern Gaza. So all of that is evidence that maybe the IDF is actually considering this so that it can kind of, what's the phrase I want? Just kind of remove all of the constraints that they have been practicing. And yes, there have been constraints. The IDF has not been operating in Gaza without any constraints. They've certainly loosened their rules of engagement considerably, but they do still have them in place. But if with this plan, they wouldn't need those kinds of very tight rules of engagement. They could kind of discard those entirely. So it seems like that might be the direction they're going. And, it's not clear yet if that's true, but criticism is starting to mount. Foreign governments, the US government in particular, has been voicing concerns about this and has been trying to pressure the Israeli government not to do that, if indeed that is what they're thinking of. I don't think anybody places much faith in American pressure on Israel at this point, so I don't think it's necessarily going to matter. So if they do want to do it, they'll probably just do it. But that is something that you'll probably be hearing about in the coming months, more so, if they are actually going to do it. So something to look forward to there. And I think those are the main items I had for Gaza and Lebanon. Humanitarian conditions in general in Gaza are deteriorating, but that's been pretty much true since last October, so no surprises there. The United States, specifically the Biden administration, sent a strongly worded letter to Israel threatening to cut off military aid if action is not taken within 30 days to address the administration's concerns regarding the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And Israel apparently did follow up on that by allowing relatively more aid trucks into Gaza, but it's not clear if that's sufficient for the Biden administration to consider their concerns addressed. I would guess not, unless the whole thing is just performative, in which case, yeah, it doesn't really matter anyway. But yeah, that kind of is where we are as far as American pressure. They could just pull aid immediately and then declare that it's only going to resume if the Israeli government adheres to American demands. But as is, the Biden administration is just sending what are literally just strongly worded letters. They're really not committed to actually taking tangible action. So, more of the same in that regard. I just thought it was particularly notable how feckless this particular example of American pressure was. As far as Yemen, which kind of is part and parcel of the conflict in the Levant, in so much as, the Houthis are kind of trying to pressure Israel and the West by attacking shipping in the Red Sea on the condition that Israel agree to a ceasefire in Gaza. The United States actually did bomb some Houthi positions, I think specifically positions related to the launching of missiles and drones that have been targeting the ships in the Red Sea. That's not unusual. That's been happening off and on basically since the Houthis started raiding shipping in the Red Sea. But what was notable about this particular example is that the United States bombed their positions using B-2 bombers. That seems a little extreme to me. I don't know why you need B-2s to do that. but I guess the Pentagon just wanted to for the sake of it. That's not necessarily that unusual for them. I think we talked before about them using F-22s to bomb targets in Syria back in 2015, and how that was totally unnecessary, but the Pentagon just wanted to do it so that they could try to use the F-22 in action. I suspect there might be something similar going on here with the B-2. That's definitely hitting a very small nail with a very big gold-plated mallet. It's a lot. Let's see, some more recent stuff in the Levant. The head of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, was assassinated. The Israelis have obviously been after him since the war started, but they finally did get him a week or two ago. And they actually got him inadvertently. You know, they've kind of got these routine FPV drone operations they conduct where they try to find militants and kill them. And during one of those routine patrols, they found some guys that they thought were Hamas in a, I think it was like in a factory or something. And so then, you know, they blew them up. Some troops were sent in to get the bodies, and one of the infantrymen noted that one of the bodies looked suspiciously like Sinwar. So, you know, they gathered some evidence, you know, his fingerprint, genetic material, what have you, and they actually did find that it was a match for Sinwar. So, doesn't really matter at all. You know, the Israeli government crowed about it and said, hey, you know, we finally got him. This is a great victory, not only for Israel, but for the region, because this was an evil man, et cetera, you know, the usual stuff. But it was also noted, even by the Israeli government, that it wasn't going to change anything. They were not going to change, you know, the course of their operations or anything like that. So the war continues apace, you know, no change. But it was notable that they did get, like, the leader of Hamas.
Damn.
Let's see. And then Hezbollah targeted Netanyahu's house with a drone. Obviously, they didn't kill him. But that does suggest that they're getting somewhat bolder in how they use their inventory. You know, thus far, Hezbollah's response to the Israeli incursion into Lebanon has been notable in how relatively quiet it's been. Like, I think people were really expecting Hezbollah to go a lot harder in the event of a conflict like this, but as is, they seem to be relatively restrained compared to what they're capable of. But at least in this case, they decided to get a little ambitious. Let's see, and then we already talked about the Israeli strike on Iran. So that's all I had for Israel. Lots of stuff going on, but the main takeaway is that none of it has really fundamentally changed the status quo. So the trajectory of the conflict remains unchanged. Let's see, what else did I think we did have some news in Ukraine. Yeah, it's a couple things, but the main one was North Korea. Have you heard about this?
No.
So North Korea is deploying troops to fight with the Russian army in Ukraine. The exact number is kind of unknown at this point. I've heard different numbers. The original article I read about it suggested 1,500, so like a small brigade. But then the Ukrainian government is saying that it's actually 12,000, which is multiple brigades. So still not a lot in the grand scheme of things. You know, there's probably like 100 brigades, probably more, scattered around different parts of Ukraine by both sides. So, you know, a couple of brigades is not going to make a huge amount of difference. But of course, the Russian army's strategy has been to basically throw cannon fodder at Ukrainian defensive positions. That's not the only part of their tactics. Obviously, they follow that up with more competent units to try to exploit weakened Ukrainian army positions. But cannon fodder is sort of the first wave. So it could be that the North Koreans are the latest and greatest in Russian shock troops. But it's the first time that I think North Korean troops have been deployed abroad for any kind of actual combat ever. It hasn't happened before. So it's definitely a notable event here as far as North Korean foreign policy. They've traditionally been very focused on the Korean Peninsula. Presumably, the North Koreans were able to extract some kind of concession from the Russian government. And from what I've read, it's probably in the form of things like technology, more support for North Korea's missile program, possibly its nuclear program, possibly also its submarine program. So I've heard different things on that count, but there's nothing really concrete yet. But presumably North Korea is going to find it much easier now to get and acquire new technologies related, new military technologies that previously were unavailable to it. Because Russia, whatever else you can say about it, had been more or less observing the international sanctions regime targeting the North Korean government. But it seems that they have seen fit now to try to abrogate certain aspects of that regime in exchange for troops. We already knew that they were getting ammunition from North Korea, but troops are new. That's definitely an escalation. So we'll see what happens there. I don't think it's going to be enough to really change the trajectory of the conflict, but of course there's room for North Korea to send more if they want. And certainly North Korea has a decent-sized army, so they could make a difference if they wanted to. But I've never known the North Korean government to be really willing to take risks for the benefit of other countries. So I'm a little skeptical that any large portion of the North Korean army will be deployed. Certainly, if they did, there would be incentive for the United States and its allies in the region to put pressure on the North Korean government. And I don't think North Korea really relishes that point. The Chinese government especially doesn't relish that point. People talk about how China and Russia are getting closer and that the war in Ukraine is as much a Chinese operation as a Russian one, but that's not really true. If anything, China is kind of upset about the war in Ukraine because China's whole foreign policy is to spread its influence via economic influence, and they were actually making substantive headway in Europe via economic influence. But the war in Ukraine really scuppered a lot of that. So, while that may have benefited Russia, it certainly has not really benefited Chinese influence operations in Europe. Certainly in East Asia, any kind of escalation between North Korea and regional powers is not going to be in China's interest. They would prefer to keep things quiet so they can continue to build economic influence. Anything that retrenches American influence in the region, which is what would happen if American allies in the region turned to the United States to help deal with North Korea, or vice versa, if the United States tried to cement its alliances in the region, to try to offset and pressure North Korea after its intervention in Ukraine. All of that is going to be just for the worse as far as China goes. They would prefer that alliance weaken, not strengthen. So from what I've read, China is not thrilled about North Korea's little adventure here, or the fact that Russia has invited them. But there's also not a whole lot they can do about it, necessarily. Or even if they could do something about it, they may not really want to do anything about it. Because again, North Korea's deployment is still relatively mild right now. And also North Korea giving Russia equipment and supplies kind of abrogates the need for China to do that. Because otherwise, obviously, the Russians would really be pressuring Beijing to help them out. So either by allowing this, they're either kind of circumventing pressure that would otherwise be placed on China. Instead, it's being placed on North Korea as far as troops and supplies going to Ukraine. But also, there could be some smuggling going on. It could be that North Korea is sort of vicariously acting as a conduit between Chinese producers and Russia, basically a third-party re-export center. So, Beijing, I think, is kind of content with this current situation, even if it prefers that none of it had happened really in the first place.
Does it seem like North Korea is trying to get their hand in just to get value from their military expenditures? Because if they're investing a large share of their economy in that.
No, I don't think so. I think it's a trade. I think they're trading ammunition and troops for technology support. Because the international sanctions regime has been pretty tough. They've found ways to circumvent it, but having direct access to relatively modern Russian equipment is going to be a big boost for them. That'll improve their capabilities.
See, that makes sense. Yeah, if the West is saying no, we won't collaborate with you in tech and we won't do business with you, then they can do a favor for a villain who will do something for you.
Yeah. And keep in mind, the Soviets supported North Korea a lot, but after the Soviet Union collapsed, they didn't get that aid anymore. And so North Korea's army both because of the sanctions and because of the cutoff in Soviet aid, has not been doing well over the past couple decades. Like they've been cut off from modern equipment, modern supplies, etc. And so their military has atrophied to a degree. And the ability to get new equipment and whatnot to kind of restock is a unique opportunity for them. And it certainly doesn't bode particularly well for security on the Korean Peninsula, because the difficulties faced by the North Korean army acted as a barrier, an inhibiting factor to any kind of aggression on the Korean Peninsula. Relatively speaking, obviously they still do it, but they can't take as many risks as they would otherwise just because of the state of the army. But the state of the army seems set to improve. So there could be corresponding knock-on effects in the peninsula as a result.
Do you think they're going to show up with some really crappy gear and stuff, or?
In Ukraine?
Yeah.
It's not really clear if they're going to bring their own equipment or if the Russians are going to equip them. One of the things I've read that could be a problem for a North Korean deployment is that the Russian army and the North Korean army don't use the same equipment. Obviously, almost all of it is like Soviet legacy equipment of one kind or another. But obviously, the North Koreans have been using older stuff, and the Russians have been using relatively newer stuff. And so that means that there could be some problems in terms of compatibility. So what I've read is that the North Korean troops that are set to be deployed are actually training in the Russian Far East, basically eastern Siberia right now, to try to learn Russian equipment, Russian command and control, all that kind of stuff to get them caught up so that they can integrate into the Russian army. So I suspect that means that the Russians will actually be equipping them, or at the very least leading them to some degree. It's possible that part of the agreement the Russians struck with the North Koreans is that the North Koreans send their own equipment. And in that case, it could be that the training going on in Siberia is purely about command and control, not about equipment. It's all just very unclear right now. We just don't really have the details.
Interesting.
Yeah, Russia has been going out of its way to hire people, I guess. They've been trying to recruit people from different parts of the world to try to fill out sort of the cannon fodder ranks. People from India, Cuba, like different people. Some of them have called their governments and say they were basically tricked into signing up and that they want help getting out. So there's been some diplomatic kerfuffles stemming from that. But that, they mostly seem to be recruiting for that reason. And so getting a bunch of North Korean troops in seems to be part and parcel of that. It could be that they're actually used for more substantive roles. You can't rule that out entirely, but given the seeming Russian priority placed on using foreign troops of one kind or another for these kinds of cannon fodder roles, I suspect the North Korean troops are going to be used for that. Yeah, one of the things I read a couple months ago is that a North Korean troop deployment was being discussed, but there wasn't anything concrete at that point. But one of the things that was brought up is that the only agreement at that time, this is back when Putin actually went to North Korea and met with Kim Jong-un. From what I read at that time, the only agreement was that the North Korean troops sent would be combat engineers, not actual infantrymen. So I haven't heard any follow-up on that aspect. It could be that the 5 to 12,000, however many it is, North Korean troops being sent are actually not infantrymen, but are purely combat engineers. But again, that was from like 6 months ago, whenever that meeting was. And the new information released about the deployment suggests that they are going to engage in combat. So that suggests maybe not combat engineers. We'll see. We're going to find out one way or the other. I did see some people talking, some analysts on Twitter talking about whether or not this represented a significant sea change, given that historically it's been Europeans going abroad to fight and not, foreign countries sending troops to Europe to fight. And I think the more convincing answer there is that it's not a big change, because actually there's always been troops from abroad that have been brought into Europe to fight in European wars. Previously, they were like imperials, basically. They were imperial troops brought from abroad to fight in like World War I, World War II, whatever. So that's not unprecedented, and it seems like that's more what's happening. The North Korea as a government sending like a full expeditionary force to try to help an ally, which would be substantively different. But as is, if I'm right that they're going to be used as just cannon fodder, North Korea sending troops is not going to be really any different than, say, Buryatia or Tuva, the autonomous provinces of Russia that are mostly ethnically non-Russian, but it's mostly disproportionately non-ethnic Russians that kind of fill out the ranks of the infantry. Most of them are still ethnically Russian, but just disproportionately. Like, given how small the population of non-ethnic Russians is in Russia, their proportion in the army is actually much larger, surprisingly so. So that's what I mean there. So I think that's kind of more what we're looking at here. So not like a big sea change in terms of like historical trends.
Interesting.
And what else did we have? Yeah, those were kind of the big highlights. The other stuff is relatively minor notes. Did we have any questions or anything?
Not sure.
I think we do. Yeah, no. Well, I did have 2 corrections. Some of these are pretty old, but I'm still throwing them out there. I thought Canada was going to have elections this year, but apparently the law is not that they have to be held by the end of October 2024, but by the end of October 2025. So they don't have to be held by the end of this year. Rather, it's going to be the end of next year. That's my mistake. The other correction had to do with the scandal involving the gubernatorial election in North Carolina. Apparently, the man's name was Mark Robinson, not Johnson, like I thought it was. So, my mistake.
You are forgiven. You are forgiven.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say that's the guy who posted on the porn site that he was a Nazi.
Oh, no. I reported someone in Dota today for having a Nazi name.
Really?
Yeah.
A Nazi name? Like referencing Nazi historical figures?
Yeah, specifically Adolf Hitler.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, the Nazi figure.
Yeah, they removed some letters to get around the like normal censorship mechanism.
Gotcha.
Yeah, normally it would say you have to choose another account name, but they removed some letters, but we destroyed them in battle and reported them to the police.
Well, we did have some stuff for Turkey here. Do you remember Gulen?
Gulen? Who's
It's
Gulen?
been a long time since we've talked about him. Do you remember the military coup in Turkey back in 2016?
Yeah, that was a failed attempt, yeah?
Yeah, the coup attempt, I should say.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess it was never proven fully. Certainly the Erdogan government insisted it was, but the theory was that the officers responsible for the coup were Gulenists. So Gulen is a sort of religious leader in Turkey, but he was also like really well off. And one of the things he did is he started a network of schools in Turkey. And, they were nominally religious schools, but the bigger thing that they ended up doing is inculcating a network of graduates. Like all the people who went to these schools and then graduated kind of maintained contact. And they formed, networks, and they were able to infiltrate the Turkish government and military. And when Gulen was allied with Erdogan, that network was actually used to infiltrate and defeat the military, which historically in Turkey has been like a powerful political institution, basically de facto politically independent. But Erdogan was able to significantly clip their wings by using these Gulenist people that were embedded in the military. They were able to secretly gather evidence, get dirt on people, etc. But what ended up happening is there was a falling out between Erdogan and Gulen. And so all of a sudden, all those Gulenists that were sort of distributed throughout the Turkish government and military, suddenly they were basically doing stuff against the interests of Erdogan. They were secretly gathering information about him and leaking it to the public and otherwise trying to damage him politically. So that wasn't going to fly with him, so we started a big crackdown, and then the coup happens. And again, never been explicitly proven that the officers responsible were Gulenists, but that's what the Turkish government said. And so after that, the government really doubled down on its anti-Gulenist purge, basically firing anybody and everybody who had anything to do with a school that was funded and led by Gulen. Now, Gulen himself actually had not lived in Turkey for a while. He actually lived in the United States. And that was a source of tension between the US government and Turkey. Erdogan obviously wanted the United States government to extradite Gulen, because, of course, the Turkish government said he was like a terrorist and all this kind of thing, whatever. And the US government said, well, you haven't presented any actual evidence of that, so we're not going to do that. And so relations soured correspondingly. However, the recent news from the past couple weeks is that Gulen actually did finally die. He was an older guy, so no surprise. But that does open the door now for some kind of potential rapprochement between the Turkish government and the American government, because now this sort of running sore in the relationship is gone now. Presumably, there's still going to be some kind of Gulenist network in Turkey. A lot of it has been hobbled by the government operations targeting them. But I don't know that the loss of Gulen himself necessarily marks the collapse of that. But regardless, certainly it makes the Turkish government happy. So that could make things easier going forward. The other Turkey news was a terrorist attack in Turkey. And this was an attack on a aviation company that makes drones. The attack was perpetrated by the PKK, which we've talked about before. That's the separatist Kurdish group, which is considered a terrorist organization by certainly Turkey, but also a number of Turkey's allies, including the United States. The terrorist attack in question involved only 2 people, and apparently they just kind of ran in guns blazing, effectively, eventually being killed themselves by the police response. I thought it was interesting. The Turkish government said that several Turkish special forces members were killed in the attack, and several more injured, which kind of surprised me. I don't know why there would necessarily be a bunch of special forces guy at a aviation company, but apparently there were. I think it was 5 dead from what I read, something to that effect. Maybe the number has changed since then. But the Turkish response was to bomb targets in eastern Syria and northern Iraq, where Kurdish groups have been active. More so eastern Syria, where the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is sort of an American-led umbrella organization, the most prominent group within that umbrella organization is the YPG, which is the main Kurdish militia in eastern Syria. The YPG is pretty closely aligned with the PKK. So bombing the YPG in eastern Syria makes sense. That's not too surprising. Northern Iraq is a little more surprising because the PKK and its affiliates don't have nearly as strong a presence there. There are other Kurdish political groups that are actually more dominant in northern Iraq. However, there actually are PKK elements immediately across the border from Turkey in the far north of Iraq, specifically in the mountains of northern Iraq. And so I suspect that that's more what Turkey was going after. So a little bit of flair there, terrorist attack, retaliation. I don't know that much will come out of it in the long run. The PKK has kind of been the subject of Turkish military operations since 2015, 2016. And there was a kind of falling out. There had been a sort of ceasefire in practice in place before that, but Erdogan's political ambitions kind of got ahead of that and eventually scuppered it. And things have not been great ever since. Basically a return to low-intensity conflict. There hadn't really been a whole lot going on, but mostly it had been skirmishing in Kurdish areas, hit-and-run guerrilla attacks, that kind of thing. The PKK hadn't really done so much explicit terrorism since the conflict renewed in 2015, but this obviously marks a return to form for them. They have used terrorist attacks in the past, and it seems they've done so again. Although it's worth pointing out that while they did attack a nominally civilian target, it also is kind of a legitimate target from a military perspective because they are making military equipment. So, whether or not a company producing military grade drones for the Turkish military constitutes a civilian target or a military target, that there is a potentially interesting debate to be had there. So I don't know that you can entirely blame the PKK here for this one. It's not like Islamic State style terror attack where they're blowing up a bomb in the middle of a crowd and killing like 100 civilians.
Right, because they were attacking other direct military units that they knew were such.
Well, not units. Again, this was a company. So, the people working in the company presumably were civilian workers. Although, again, that still raises the question of what the special forces guys were doing there. That still seems weird to me. But, let's assume they were all like civilians, non-combatants, let's say, just working at the company. Are those guys legitimate targets or not? Because, again, they're not combatants, however it's pronounced.
Combatants, yeah.
There you go. They're not combatants, but they are producing weapons that are being used against the PKK. So, they're not engaging in like just normal commercial activity here. It is explicitly linked to military operations by the Turkish military. So does that matter? Does that change things? Let's see. So that's all I had for Turkey. Yeah, nothing really big going on in Turkey. Some items here, but I don't think it's projected to really change the course of things. Erdogan still has a pretty solid grip. I think the Turkish economy is doing a little better since Erdogan finally did allow the central bank to increase interest rates. Inflation is still relatively high, but it's not spinning out of control like it used to be. So overall, the trajectory in Turkey is actually relatively positive. And of course, they make a shit ton of money off of stuff getting re-exported through Turkey to Russia. That's been a big boon as well. Yeah, Turkey trying to play both sides, profiting correspondingly. Let's see. I guess since we're in the region, the United States did sign an agreement with the Iraqi government that will see all American forces leave the country in 2026. It's a withdrawal that's going to happen in 2 phases from now until 2026. The U.S. did note that there's going to be an advisory team that stays behind in Iraq to continue to help the Iraqi military. But American air assets will no longer be deployed to air bases, and presumably there will be a corresponding, curtailment of related military forces, contractors, suppliers, etc. Let's see. Oh, and the advisory team is actually going to be in the Kurdish part of Iraq. So it's not just going to be a Kurdish team that's going to help like the Iraqi military specifically. They're actually going to focus more on helping Kurdish allies. So, the U.S. will still have a small presence, but it's not going to have like kinetic forces deployed like it has since 2014 when the Islamic State kind of moved into northern Iraq and the United States committed to pushing them back and suppressing them. So there will finally be, since 2014, a full withdrawal of American forces. It seems that is in the cards. Whether or not that actually happens, anybody's guess. A lot can happen between now and 2026. So we'll see. But for now, at least, there's a nominal commitment for a withdrawal to actually happen. Keep in mind that even if the United States does withdraw from Iraq, it'll still have bases in eastern Syria where it has air assets. So we still won't be far away.
We'll have assets where, you said?
Eastern Syria, where we're allied with the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurds, basically. We've been working with the Kurds in eastern Syria to fight the Islamic State since 2014, and we've had assets on the ground, air assets, and also we've had a small ground contingent of special forces also deployed.
Chat was asking what you mean by the word kinetic.
Oh, that Yeah, so I mean, if you have troops on the ground in a country, they're not necessarily actually engaged in combat operations. They could just be doing things like intelligence gathering and sharing, logistics, advise and assist type stuff. Nothing that involves actually killing anybody, basically. So kinetic operations are operations where you are trying to kill people. So not involved in kinetic operations implies that you're no longer actively like sending aircraft to bomb anybody or sending special forces to kill anybody, nothing like that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay,
Kinetic is shooty patooty.
there you go.
Direct military action. That was one of the things that we mentioned during the discussion with Bitter Sugar, which was the surprise at Russia, who is kind of a brother nation to Ukraine, choosing direct military action in an area when prior to that they had done other forms of influence like propaganda, corruption, cutting deals with people, giving them advantages, giving them funding, that sort of way to establish control. And they could have slowly gone for that method where they just keep leaning into that, keep making it easy for Russian people to live there, rewarding people who have favorable policies toward Russia, like stuff like that, versus the just like, okay, now we're going to send dudes at you and attack you. It's like, okay, that's different.
Yeah, it was a radical escalation on their part, and I still maintain that it wasn't necessary. I think Russia could have achieved all of its objectives without doing that, but we are where we are.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting that you bring that up, and maybe this can kind of lead into a broader conversation here. Let me write this down real quick. So an example of Russia influence operations, and also an example of the vision, so to speak, that the Russian government has for Ukraine, or at least had. I don't know how ambitious the Russian government still is right now, but we'll see. But there are two countries where Russia continues to use, non-kinetic operations, shall we say, in order to maintain its influence. So those two are Belarus and Georgia. And Georgia is more topical right now because they just had an election, but Belarus is probably more relevant as far as Ukraine. Because Belarus is a fellow Slavic country like Ukraine, and Russia, kind of like with Ukraine, kind of feels entitled to have Belarus within its sphere of influence. And so, Belarus has much better relations with Russia than Ukraine does, obviously. And I think some of the things Belarus has done that have facilitated those good relations are an example of what Russia wanted Ukraine to do, or at least what Russia wanted to happen in Ukraine. So, for one, Belarus doesn't have nearly as strong a distinct ethnic identity from Russia. Or maybe I should say Belarusians don't have as distinct an ethnic identity as that of ethnic Russians. And the Belarusian government has kind of reinforced that by not fully embracing the reemergence of Belarusian ethnic identity and language. Since the Soviet Union collapsed and Belarus has become independent, they have actually still maintained Russian as the prime language of government, the economy, etc. Other states, including Ukraine, have done the opposite. They've gone out of their way to try to push their distinct language and identity through government policy, but Belarus never did that. And so as a result, there's not nearly the same sense that Belarus is trying to pull away from Russia. So that's helped relations, but it's also meant that people who are actually distinctly Belarusian have not really been able to kind of see the same resurgence in their own culture that you've seen in places like Ukraine, Lithuania, et cetera, and these other places that have been more forceful in trying to de-Sovietize, so to speak. Obviously, Belarus, in terms of security, is oriented much more towards Russia, and that's itself been like one of, if not the main things that's maintained relations between Russia and Belarus. So actually, they did not really until relatively recently allow like large deployments of Russian troops in Belarus, but I think what changed there is the mass protests a couple years ago when Belarus had an election that everybody knew was going to be rigged. Everybody knew that Lukashenko was going to win, but there were mass protests anyway as people in Belarus tried to fight to make the government accountable and democratic. Obviously, that didn't work, but it did have the effect of significantly souring relations between the Belarusian government and the European Union. And Lukashenko's foreign policy has basically been to play Russia and the European Union off each other. He doesn't actually himself explicitly align with Putin and Russia. Rather, he just wants to make sure that nobody has too much leverage over him such that they can threaten his hold on power. But because of the mass protests, the European Union curtailed contact and heaped pressure on Belarus to varying degrees. And the result is that Lukashenko felt he had no choice but to try to shift towards Russia in order to offset that pressure. And one of the changes that resulted in is Russian troops entering into Belarus on a much larger scale than had been done before. So the fact that Russian troops are kind of running around Belarus and invaded Ukraine from Belarus is not necessarily indicative of significant affinity for the Russian government in Minsk. It has more to do with just transactional politics. The Russians demanded that in exchange for helping the Belarusian government out during the mass protests. There were a number of Russian police, as well as basically what are called National Guardsmen, that were sent to Belarus to help suppress the mass protests. So that was the quid pro quo there. But Lukashenko since then has been very cagey about the degree to which he really wants to help Russia. The Russian government wanted him to send troops into Ukraine to help them with the fight there. That never happened, despite the fact that Lukashenko himself said, yeah, that's totally a thing I'm going to do, and then proceeded never to do so. So that's kind of been his play thus far. He voices support for Putin for their war in Ukraine, but then when it comes to actually contributing anything substantive to the war, nothing ever actually happens. And so I think that betrays the fact that Lukashenko was not actually interested in helping either Russia or Ukraine. He's purely interested in helping Mr. Lukashenko. That's his main objective as far as policy, both domestic and foreign. But even so, even though he's kind of toyed with the Russians on that count, the Russians still prefer him to any kind of actual democratic government or anything. Because with a democratic government, there's the possibility of a realignment in Belarusian foreign policy, an emergence of a Belarusian identity, ethnic identity, or cultural identity that is distinct from that of the Russians. The Russians see that as a threat because they see the emergence of a non-Russian identity as inherently threatening. They think that so long as people are more Russia-leaning, not only politically but just linguistically, then that suggests a block to any kind of integration with the West, because they believe that Russians are inherently inimical to the West and that any kind of true Russian is not going to allow their country to align with the West. So, it's kind of part and parcel of their broader influence operations and their near abroad, as they call it. So that's what they want to see in places, specifically in Belarus and Ukraine, since those are the Slavic countries. There are actually Russian nationalists who believe that the destiny of Belarusians and Ukrainians, basically Slavic peoples in general in the Russian near abroad, is to assimilate into Russian culture and to just become fully fledged ethnic Russians. But I don't think that's necessarily representative of what the broader Russian government has in mind. I think they do just want strong Russian cultural influence in the form of language use and political identity to be retained in Belarus and Ukraine so that they can remain in Russia's orbit. They see that as one of the ways they can do that. So Belarus then is, in these ways, a useful case study as far as understanding what Russia wanted for Ukraine. And at this point, whether that's still achievable in Ukraine is, highly debatable. It seems probably not. But it's also not clear how the war is going to pan out, so it could be that they still have that in their back pocket as that kind of stretch goal. We'll see. But another example of a non-Slavic country in Russia's near abroad where they're projecting influence is Georgia. And the way they project influence there is a little bit different. They're less invested in trying to propagate Russian language use, Russian politics, Russian media consumption. In Georgia's case, they're more interested in propping up local proxies. And in Georgia's case, that's a billionaire named Ivanishvili, something to that effect. He became a billionaire in Russia itself, but he was of Georgian descent, and he eventually went back to Georgia and ran for office and was able to win the presidency in the wake of the 2008 Georgian war with Russia, which of course Georgia lost, which greatly discredited the pro-Western government at the time, which was then led by Mikhail Saakashvili. So in the wake of that, Georgia Dream was formed. That was Ivanishvili's party, and they've been holding on to power ever since. And they, of course, received significant support from the Russian government, both diplomatically and also probably financially, in terms of money sent. Ivanishvili's whole party platform is basically, let's be friends with Russia, let's integrate with the West as well. He knows that's popular, and no politician can really come out and just say, we don't want to integrate with the West. But while he does say that he wants to integrate with the West, he also kind of caveats that by saying that he doesn't want to do anything that necessarily spites Russia too much. And also, by the way, he I shouldn't say impose. He has pushed his party to pass a lot of legislation that is not congruent with integration with the West. So he says he wants it, but then he does things that kind of sabotages it. The NGO law being a case in point. They passed an NGO law that makes it more difficult for NGOs to raise money from abroad. And of course, that's very similar to a law that was passed in Russia that was implicitly seen as targeting NGOs that were seen as fighting for things like liberal democracy, et cetera, government accountability, that kind of thing. So the European Union saw that, didn't like it, and they've significantly curtailed their negotiations with Georgia about eventual membership in things like the European Union and whatnot. But the Georgian Dream Party, again, Ivanishvili's party, they discount that. They say, if the EU has a problem with that, then that's a problem they have with Georgian sovereignty, and it's really none of their business. So they basically just refuse to admit that that's been a problem at all, and they say that negotiations continue and that the public shouldn't be worried about it, blah, blah, blah. But the gist of it is that the Georgian Dream Party has received support from Russia, and they have very much pushed a more pro-Russian narrative. Relatively speaking, there are limits to how much you can do that in a society with Georgian nationalists in it, right? They're not going to accept too much of a pro-Russian bent, but they have focused more on peace. That's the big thing they've said. They haven't really couched their argument too much in terms of friendship per se between Russia and Georgia. But what they have said is that any kind of aggressive nationalist government would result in war with Russia, like in 2008. And so they say it would be much better for Georgia to have a less ambitious foreign policy in order to preserve the peace. So that's been the crux of their message. It's been relatively popular. They've also delved into the culture war bullshit. Russia is hardly alone in pushing that. We even have that in the United States. But Georgia's Dream has leaned into that to some effect. So that's also part of their popularity. They're seen as the party of sort of traditional culture, traditional cultural values, traditional cultural institutions, that kind of thing. And so the opposition says that they're too pro-Russian, they're not doing enough to get us integrated with the West, and also the opposition tends to be much more urban and liberal in outlook generally. But they haven't been able to leverage their support for those things into significant success in elections. Georgia Dream has been able to kind of exploit the drama from 2008 to great effect. Also, there was a number of controversies involving Saakashvili's previous government, involving corruption and abuse of prisoners. They've been able to profit from that as well. But regardless, there's been an ongoing fight, a kind of culture war in Georgia between relatively more Western-aligned, liberal-aligned factions. I think there's like 4 different opposition parties, and the Georgia Dream, which is just basically the opposite of all that. And it's been pretty even though Georgia Dream has come out ahead perpetually for like 10 years now. And they actually just had a big election in which the opposition was hoping to finally take back power. But the results seem to indicate otherwise. I don't think like the results have been finalized. But the results thus far suggest that Georgia Dream has retained power. And the opposition isn't happy about it. They did pretty well. I think Georgia Dream won with like just over 50%. It was like 52% last I checked or something like that. But still, the opposition is upset, and they allege that the exit polling that was done for the election suggests that that the opposition actually did much better. It may have actually won the election. And they suggest that the incongruency between the exit polling and the announced election results suggests there may have been election fraud. I don't know that there's much they can do about it. Georgia Dream says that there will be normal processes engaged in to kind of deal with the allegations, but there doesn't seem to be any fireworks in the cards for now. Hypothetically, the opposition could stage mass protests and kind of challenge the Georgia Dream Party here, but it hasn't happened yet. and I don't know that it necessarily will. Yeah, the opposition was especially excited because all of the 4 different main opposition parties all grouped together to form a single ticket, which they hadn't done before. So that had people particularly optimistic they might be able to make it work this time. But at this point, it seems not. Now, to bring this back to the original point, Russia's support for the Georgia Dream Party is an example of how they exert influence in a non-Slavic society that they feel sort of more culturally entitled to kind of influence. In Georgia's case, it's much more focused on political parties and proxies of Russia rather than a broader cultural program of trying to maintain Russian cultural influence. But those are both options on the table as far as Russian influence in their near abroad. And in Ukraine's case, they just kind of gave up on that. They eventually went with the nuclear option. It just did full conventional invasion.
The most aggressive possible.
Yeah, unfortunately. Did you see the drama about the Washington Post?
No, what happened?
So the Washington Post has declined to endorse a candidate for president this year.
Ooh.
It's the first time they've done it since the 60s, the 70s, I think, something like that. A long time. And maybe that wouldn't be a big deal, save for the fact that people who work for the newspaper said that it was Jeff Bezos's intervention that resulted in that non-endorsement. They'd apparently originally planned to endorse Harris, and they were actually even in the process of writing up, the editorial in which they announced it. But apparently Bezos stepped in and said that, I don't want you to do that. So the staff at the Washington Post is pretty livid right now. They see this as being explicit political interference by the owner. And so the senior editor of the Washington Post has already resigned, and there could be more resignations to come.
Damn. That's interesting. It's kind of funny that we as outsiders talk about the oligarchs of Russia and Ukraine, and it's like, bro, we have our own oligarchs. Bezos like doing stuff, Musk being very pro-Trump. Yeah, the people with money definitely are invested in the outcome. So
Yeah.
they're throwing their weight behind stuff. Stay safe. Use your own brain, even if you see a funny quip from a candidate or your favorite billionaire oligarch person throws their weight behind someone. That doesn't mean that you should too, because they have a lot of different investments and reasons in a life situation than you or I. So not really good people to follow in that sense.
Yeah, Musk has been more overt in that regard. Bezos has been playing it relatively quiet. So this is the most overt example of him getting involved that I know of. Yeah. It's a significant sign. It's kind of significant in that it's a sign of the times, but I don't think it surprises anybody. And I would point out that nobody really gave a shit about the Washington Post's endorsement. Who they endorsed wasn't really going to change the way anybody voted. But it's more notable that they've not endorsed someone because of interference by their owner. That is notable, and that is a change. So whether this marks a period where there's going to be more overt interference in a major newspaper's editorial stance, or if this is just a one-off by Bezos, we'll see. I think, to be fair to Bezos, his argument was that he just didn't want his newspaper to be partial. He wanted them to be impartial and to focus just on reporting the election rather than endorsing somebody and being seen to pick a side. But at the same time, that is still editorial interference. So you can't really buy a newspaper and say you're going to maintain editorial independence and then do shit like that. So there's going to be questions now about the Washington Post's independence and whether or not Bezos's personal interests are going to be influencing them going forward. And I would point out that his personal interests were already influencing the paper as far as editorials. That's not that unusual, but as far as like the actual reporting in the newspaper, that had been decent as I understand it. But this seems to bring that into question now. So we'll see.
How often does a paper like the Washington Post endorse a candidate in general? I didn't know that was a thing. Do they like give an advertisement for both candidates, or is it specifically the people who work there advocating for one?
So what'll happen is that the senior editor will post an editorial in which they explicitly endorse one or the other candidate.
Oh.
That's pretty normal. It's pretty normal for newspapers to do that.
Okay, didn't know that.
Yeah, like I mentioned, this is the first time the Washington Post has not endorsed a candidate for president in the United States since, the 60s, like half a century.
Damn.
So it was kind of normal for them to do that.
So he didn't let them have their tradition. Okay. I didn't know this was a thing. I've never read about who to vote for in a newspaper, but I guess you could.
Well, like I said, nobody gives a shit, right? Like who newspapers endorse doesn't really matter, especially in the age of the internet where people are much more influenced by alternative sources of information. People don't like getting their information from mainstream media because it's funded by billionaires. They prefer to get their information from these sort of smaller websites that are less accountable and also funded by billionaires. You can't really get away from it. Websites that are funded secretly are not going to be more accountable than mainstream media. Effectively, you're just consuming the same shit that's been repackaged, but whatever floats your boat.
Can you give me the same propaganda but on a different platform? Thank you.
Yeah, that's pretty much what it comes down to at this point. The internet's era where it was like the source for true alternative information is kind of past at this point.
Yeah, too much noise now.
Yeah. Actually, speaking of noise, did you see Donald Trump was on Joe Rogan's podcast?
Yes, Chad asked me about that today. I did not see any of it though.
Yeah, I haven't seen it either. I've seen clips, but I haven't sat down and actually watched it, which is what I would prefer to do since clips generally are taken out of context. So I'll try to squeeze that into my busy schedule. I don't know how much I can do there, though. My schedule is just filled to the brim with Factorio.
Okay. Well, if you do get the time.
Let's see. Are we doing okay on time?
Yeah. We just got a nice raid from Trisha. Also, Vibe and Flip a Flapjack have raided this evening. Excellent. Thank you all. I figure we can kind of let world discussion go until questions sort of wind down and we're caught up, and then we can flip games after a quick break.
Well, I only had a couple more.
We did have a few questions too, I think.
Oh, we did? Okay.
Yeah, someone asking about a recent Brics summit.
That's in my notes. That's actually the next thing.
Okay, good.
Yeah, the Brics organization, if you like, they're having a summit. And I never really pay much attention to them because nothing ever really happens, for all of the talk of the Brics organization being like an alternative institution of global governance to Western institutions like the IMF and whatnot. That's way oversold. Like, there's too many countries that are just at odds with each other in the organization. And the Brics mandate is super narrow. I think they've created an investment bank, but it doesn't have all that much money. And I don't think they've lent out all that much. And the fact that there's no real strategic alignment between the different members means that there's a cap, basically. There's a hard cap on how much the Brics are actually going to substantively do as an organization. There is room for cooperation on issues of common interest, but none of that is stuff that you really needed Brics to do. That's all stuff that they would have done anyway on a bilateral basis or maybe a multilateral basis. So, Brics increasingly looks more and more just like a forum for countries that have a couple of things in common that they can cooperate on. It's not like this major strategic bloc forming. But the reason I had it in my notes is that I found it interesting that Brazil actually vetoed the accession of Venezuela into Brics. That actually surprised me. There's been a lot of countries joining Brics lately over the past couple years. I assumed Venezuela would be among them. It makes sense. But Brazil has actually put their foot down and said, no, we're not going to do that. And the reason they did that is because of the recent election. Brazil has a relatively Brazil has an explicitly left-wing government right now. Lula da Silva is the president. So, yeah, that's very left-wing. he's kind of ideologically aligned with the Venezuelan government in the sense that they're both left-wing, but even Lula da Silva doesn't entirely like the Venezuelan government's authoritarian streak. And so when there was explicit election fraud alleged in the recent Venezuelan election, Lula da Silva was not as critical as other governments in the region, but he did ask that the Venezuelan government produce actual evidence and statistics regarding the vote so that it could be independently verified that there was no fraud. And the Venezuelan government promised to do that and then never followed up. So the Brazilian government, I don't think, was especially interested in heaping pressure on Venezuela, but I don't think they're really interested either in legitimizing an authoritarian government. And the Venezuelan government also causes some problems for Brazil, just in terms of the uncontrolled immigration that kind of flows into northern Brazil. Lots of for all of the Venezuelans that have come into the United States and aggravated the anti-immigration crowd, there's even more that have gone into Brazil. And so it's a much more pressing issue for them. So I think the Brazilian government here has kind of thrown up its hands and says, if the Venezuelan government isn't going to at least pretend to work with us here, we're not going to do them any favors. And so in keeping with their policy that they should not recognize the government's election win unless there's more done by the Venezuelan government to produce evidence that they actually won without cheating, they're not going to recognize the government, and they're going to hobble international efforts by that government to join organizations like Brics. So I thought that was a really interesting example of Brazil acting as a kind of regional hegemon. I think Brazil has always kind of wanted that role, but they haven't really had a lot of capacity to do that until now. So, with the Brics organization, they do actually have a point of leverage that they can use over countries in the region. If you want to join Brics, then you have to get the okay from Brazil. And if Brazil wants you to do something as a quid pro quo for that, you kind of have to. So an interesting flex here by Brazil as far as managing, quote unquote, the region. Also interesting in that it kind of shows that Brazil and other countries in Brics actually can kind of use it as an alternative UN Security Council in a way. The UN Security Council was originally envisioned as a council of the world's major powers in which they could kind of get together and negotiate with each other on issues that overlapped in their respective spheres of influence. Nominally, the original vision for the UN is that the major powers on the Security Council would be responsible for their respective spheres of influence, and then the Security Council would be more about dealing with points of tension between them. So Brazil, kind of wanting that sphere of influence in South America is kind of exercising that here. But China and other countries, the main ones, Russia, India, South Africa, kind of, I guess, the other major members of Brics kind of have not exercised similar such power. They've been more interested in just expanding Brics as an organization. I think Russia and China in particular kind of want it to be an alternative global institution, but the problem is that Brazil and India don't really care about that so much. For them, it's just more about their own national interests. So Brazil vetoing the accession of Venezuela kind of runs counter to the interest of China and Russia in expanding the organization as much as possible so that they can maximize its potential as a global institution. And that tension between, Sino-Russian interests on the one hand and then Brazil's regional interests on the other kind of illustrates some of the tensions that are going to hobble Brics going forward. The bigger any organization, the more difficult it is to engage in substantive decision making. You can see that in groups like the UN and whatnot, or the United States Congress, for example. Just the more people you have with their finger in the pie, just the more difficult it is to kind of come to a decision. And as Brics grows, that's going to be more and more of a problem. And again, like I said before, the disparate interests between those major powers in the group, those kind of inherently act as a limiting factor. So I would not invest too much into Brics as a true alternative. That's the long and short of it. And this incident with Venezuela and Brazil just kind of underscores that. Also, as a side note, the Venezuelan government asserted that the Brazilian government's action here constituted an act of aggression against Venezuela, which I thought was cute.
They said we couldn't be in a club. That's aggressive. Funny.
Okay. just some minor, I guess since we're in Latin America here. Mexico's Senate passed a proposal which would make reforms to the Constitution, quote unquote, unchallengeable. So, up till now, if you make a change to the Constitution, hypothetically, that could go before the Supreme Court, basically, of Mexico. And they could challenge that, checks and balances and whatnot. But the Senate here is basically trying to make it so that the judiciary cannot stop changes to the Constitution. So that'll represent a significant curtailing of the judicial branch's ability to act as a check and balance on the rest of the government. So this is kind of part of a broader shift here happening in Mexican politics, where populist political forces are cementing their control of the government. And what that means as far as Mexico politically is unclear. It could be that they shift towards an authoritarian model or not, again, unknown. But I think more particularly, this raises questions for the economic arena. Because if you're a foreign investor looking at Mexico, then what you're seeing here is a deterioration in the institutions, specifically the judiciary, which you're kind of leaning on to protect you as a foreign investor. Because, if the whole political system is, if the whole legal system is politicized, which seems to be the direction the government is going, then that means that you can't necessarily count on laws in place that are designed to protect foreign investors to actually be enforced. And so that's going to act as a significant disincentive to future foreign investment in Mexico. And potentially it could lead to a reduction in existing investment in Mexico, existing foreign investment in Mexico, that is. And that's relevant to the United States in particular because, of course, we have the big free trade treaty between the US, Mexico, and Canada, what used to be called NAFTA, now it's called USMCA. If there is kind of a collapse there, like if the Mexican government politicizes its legal system and then does a bunch of stuff that is clearly in violation of NAFTA, or maybe even if it isn't in violation of NAFTA provisions, but just aggravates and alienates the business community such that they don't want to invest in Mexico anymore, you could see either an explicit or de facto abrogation of the treaty, which means that there could be a de facto or de jure into free trade between the United States and Mexico. And that would be a really interesting outcome if it did come to that, because there's been a lot of drama in the United States as far as the impact of free trade. Obviously, China has had a big impact in that regard, but before China and the China shock, there was NAFTA and the Mexico shock, so to speak. There was a significant shift of jobs, specifically manufacturing jobs, out of the United States into Mexico after NAFTA was signed and then implemented. So there's been some pressure, specifically by sort of the Trumpista wing of the Republican Party, to try to make it harder for free trade to happen between Mexico and the United States so that those jobs can come back. Those efforts were largely unsuccessful. The renegotiation of NAFTA into the USMCA was largely superficial, and in fact, in a lot of ways, it actually just sort of modernized and improved it. So not much was actually substantively done to bring jobs back from Mexico. But it could be that the Mexican government, by way of populism, ends up doing it for them, ironically. So if that happens, it could bring the whole issue to kind of a conclusion. If foreign businesses don't think they can do business in Mexico, that is either going to bring those jobs back to the United States or probably more likely send them to another developing country where relations and free trade agreements with the United States are better. So it's not clear if that's it's not clear yet if that's actually going to happen. This is speculation on my part, but this is a trend that I've been following for a couple months now, and it only really seems to be moving in one direction. So the trajectory is towards eventual fireworks, potential drama in the economic relationship, and by extension, the political relationship. But for now, we're still in the early stages, but it is moving there. We're getting there. So, keep your eye on this. I don't know if Dagnip still watches, but I did have an interesting tidbit from Argentina.
He's here today.
Oh, cool. Tell him I said hi, or I guess I could. Hello. Hope he's doing well. So he probably knows exactly what I'm going to say. There was an article in the BBC News about this. There was a transport minister working in the city of Buenos Aires, which is, the largest city and capital of Argentina. And he went on to a radio program and said that his province, which is, again, is basically Buenos Aires, should consider becoming an independent nation. And he pointed out that he himself didn't support that, but he thought that it should at least be considered given the disparity between the taxes collected from Buenos Aires and what Buenos Aires gets back from the government. This is kind of an old dilemma you can see in a number of countries. Generally, the wealthier provinces of a country are not on good terms with the government because the government kind of milks them for taxes that it spends on other parts of the country, or just gets stolen. And generally, those wealthy provinces don't get that much of it back. And that can lead to separatist tendencies. Now, I don't think there's any real separatist tendencies in like Buenos Aires politics, at least none that I'm aware of. Maybe Dagnip can correct me on that. But that said, it was interesting that he brought it up, and it does kind of illustrate tensions between right and left in Argentina. Because, of course, right now the national government is led by a radical libertarian, and he's not on the best of terms with polities within Argentina like Buenos Aires, which tends to kind of have, at least as I understand it, tends to be more left-oriented in Argentine politics. So, this is a sign that maybe those tensions are getting worse. I don't think anybody seriously expects anything to come of this, but I did find it notable. I should throw out the usual disclaimer before I forget again. Maybe this is a good time. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later, so I will get the feedback. And I do enjoy and learn from all the feedback we get. Oh, did you want a stupid one?
Yeah.
So there was a billionaire, Mikhail Rogachev, in Russia, 64 years old, former vice president of the Yukos oil company, which basically de facto state-owned, even though it's nominally independent. Well, he died recently. Care to guess how?
Oh, oil company. He died. Was it a wind turbine?
Wind turbine.
I heard they hate those.
No. He fell out of a window.
Oh no. How?
Seems to happen a lot in Russia.
Oh no.
So yeah, I'm not sure who he pissed off in Moscow, but apparently somebody.
Do they post it in the news in Russia that they fell out of a window?
I assume so. I mean, the original source for the article I read was a news article in Russia.
Is it called a homicide or a what?
I think they just described it as him, accidentally. I don't think they even said accident. I think they said he fell out of a window. They just very straight and to the point.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they characterized it in any way. But everybody at this point kind of knows what that means.
Defenestration.
Yeah. Yeah, Russia is fast becoming the republic of defenestration. It's kind of the chosen approach of the Russian government for dealing with people that it wants to get rid of. Well, did we have any more questions?
There was someone asking if you talked about Tren de Aragua. I don't know what that is.
Tren de Aragua.
Tren de Aragua, 3 words.
De Aragua.
Fuzzy Cord says there are questions in Discord.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. Oh, okay. Yeah, now I see it. Trend de Aragua. I don't see that in here. Yeah, I'm not sure what that is.
Oh, it's an organization. I just Googled it. Texas Governor Greg Abbott urged Vice President Kamala Harris to declare the violent Venezuelan prison gang Tren de Aragua a foreign terrorist
Oh,
organization.
okay, yeah. Yeah, that's the biggest gang in Venezuela. They've been more active in the United States since the immigration wave came in. Yeah, it's basically just an organized crime group. It's not that different than like the Russian mafia, the Mexican mafia, the cartels, etc. So yeah, they've become more active, which is unfortunate, but otherwise it's just normal organized crime activity. It doesn't surprise me. Let's see. How likely is it that China will use its ownership of parts of the US equities markets as an attempt to devalue the US dollar? Not that likely. I mean, it's going to hurt them too, because they're going to lose money if they try to sell off everything all at once. If they do it slowly, then it's not going to be that impactful. There's going to be people who just buy it up, and then there you go. At most, that'll be like a slight devaluation for the equities in question. As far as like undermining the dollar, there's not a whole lot they can actually do about it, realistically. I mean, we've talked about the dollar at length before. There's kind of a persistent myth that the only reason the US dollar is the world's premier global currency is because of American imperialism, or this, that, or the other agreement with an oil producing country like Saudi Arabia. But the reality is just more mundane. Like, it's a combination of safe, it's a relatively safe asset to trade in, and it's just very available. As the result of the collapse of the Bretton Woods system is that there was a whole shit ton of dollars scattered around the world, and they were just ready for use by pretty much anybody. And because everybody's relatively confident in the dollar, and that the American government isn't just going to devalue it suddenly for no reason, it's been like the default choice for global trade. So you would have to get another currency that wants to really challenge that primacy would have to become as ubiquitous in trading markets, and then at the same time be produced by a government that is as trustworthy as the American government, at least as far as fiscal policy and currency policy. And that's a pretty tough combination to do, even with all of America's fiscal problems. The fact that we have the world's largest economy means that if the rubber hit the road, we could probably stabilize the fiscal situation in the United States if we really wanted to. So markets still have confidence in that regard. But another country like, say, China, the country in question here, there's not nearly as much trust in them because the government is opaque. Like, you don't know what they're going to do, and there's no legal impediments to them doing whatever they want to do. So if they want to just completely devalue the currency and radically destroy its value in a very short time frame, you would not get any kind of leading indicator of that. You would not get any kind of forewarning. It would just happen. And that risk itself puts the Chinese at a big disadvantage in that regard as far as currency. And then also just the lack of legal impediments. Just even if there were some kind of forewarning, there would be no way for anybody to like litigate it or stop it. It would just happen. So just politically speaking, structurally speaking, the Chinese government is at a disadvantage, and that's going to inherently make it difficult for them to make the yuan a major traded currency in international affairs. Just beyond that, they would have to deal with those two factors. And I don't think it's likely. So the fact that China owns a lot of US treasuries and other assets, that doesn't really matter much. That's not going to change anything.
Faith in institutions an advantage once again.
Yeah. But I guess the question isn't can China do it? It's how likely is China to try? I don't think it's that likely, because I don't think, even with relations relatively more tense than they used to be, I don't think Sino-American tensions are at the point where China really wants to go to the mat with the United States. You can kind of see that in how they've hedged their bets as far as dealing with Ukraine and Russia, and as far as how they've dealt with the trade war. They haven't really gone nearly as hard as they could in terms of like cutting off the United States from critical minerals and other things that they could bottleneck if they wanted to. So, they're playing it relatively conservative right now. They're mostly just focused on building up their self-sufficiency as much as possible. That seems to be their bigger priority rather than picking fights with Washington. Let's see, what do you think of the recent protest in Britain? Do you think Tommy Robinson will have any impact on the overall decisions made by the government? If you're talking about the protests I think you're talking about, they're not all that recent. I think those were the far-right protests a couple months ago. Do you remember those?
Far
We talked
protests,
about
where
it
you said?
briefly. There was like the little girl who was murdered. Actually, it was a dance troupe of little girls. Or not a troupe, it was a dance school of little girls that was attacked by an immigrant guy.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Well, the rumor was that it was an immigrant guy, and then the rumor caused far-right riots.
Yeah.
And then it turned out that he wasn't actually an immigrant, but by then it was kind of too late. Yeah, we talked about it when it happened. I'm not surprised by it. There is a general rising tide of right-wing populism in Europe and the United States, and has been for some years now. So something like that was probably guaranteed to happen sooner or later, and probably will happen again. If it happened in South Asia, nobody would bat an eye. They would just call it communal violence. But in Europe and the West more generally, we tend to think of ourselves as being somehow better. We're more civilized. We don't have communal violence. We just have bad people doing bad things. But I think it's going to be more and more normal over time. Not to say that it's good. I'm just saying, like, that's the expectation. I don't think the underlying factors that contributed to it have been addressed or are going to be addressed, or maybe even can be addressed. So I think we have more of that to look forward to in the future. I'm not sure about Tommy Robinson. Which one was that? Oh, right, he was arrested. Right. Anti-Islam campaigner. I haven't heard all the details about that. The article I read about it said that he didn't cooperate with authorities, and so they arrested him on terrorism charges. So I'm not sure if they were investigating him because he was involved in some kind of terrorism and they wanted to get him for that, or if he just didn't cooperate with authorities and so they booked him on a technicality. Maybe not cooperating with authorities on some kind of investigation that's peripherally linked with terrorism could itself result in a charge on terrorism. So without knowing the details on it, I can't comment on it too much. I think it happened fairly recently, so I don't think there's too much information as of yet. I would note that the British government has gone a lot harder going after far-right elements in its politics than the United States has. I think they went out of their way to ban, what was it, the English Defence League? There was like some far-right ethno-nationalist group that was labeled a terrorist organization and was broken up. It's like 10, 20 years ago when they did that. Not nearly as much aggression in Washington. Tends to be a little more lenient. But yeah, I can't comment too much on this particular arrest. So not the most satisfying answer I know, but that's an honest one. Let's see, if you were to travel through time to a point in the past where you could make the largest positive difference to human development, when would you go and what would your strategy be? Would you try to explain a technology yet to be invented in economic theory? I mean, you don't have to travel through time to make a big impact on human development. Like, there's plenty of stuff you can do here and now. It's because people do it. People have been proactive in trying to steer human events in a positive direction that we've been as successful as a species as we've been, especially over the past couple hundred years. But that said, as far as like bottlenecks, where you could like, I don't know, do disproportionately, or maybe not do, but where you could have a disproportionate impact on human development. I don't know that there's any one point you could pick. I mean, you could pretty much just take all modern technology as best as you can remember and pretty much take it back to any given point in history and have a big impact. I guess just in terms of like compound interest, you could just go back as far as possible and try to get everybody updated on as much modern technology as possible in order to try to get them to leap ahead. Probably have some problems there in so much as like time and experience are partly how modern institutions are shaped and get support. You know, you can't really just go back to a pre-industrial era and just kind of lay post-industrial institutions on top of that pre-industrial society. That's probably not going to work out too well. Probably be a lot of friction there. But you can't just give them technology. So, you know, whether or not that leads to less or more human conflict is debatable. Human experience with technological advancement since the Industrial Revolution is not encouraging in that regard, but I don't know. It's kind of a tough call. Like an economic theory. I don't think economic theory is, as an economist especially, I can tell you that there's not like an economic theory that you can take back to any point in history and have it change outcomes. You know, economic theory is not nearly as influential as people think it is. You know, really, economic policy in pretty much every government throughout history has been a function of the interests of whoever is in power and not predicated on like the optimal policy as outlined by academics. The only time academic recommendations get implemented is when it conveniently dovetails with what the government already wants to do. Rare has it been that governments have done otherwise.
Otherwise, the academics would have already taken over the world.
Yeah. So I don't think economic theories would matter. Largest positive difference to human development. I don't know, maybe I guess you could, I'm thinking more proactively in terms of like early improvements, but maybe we can think more about avoiding declines. So in that sense, you could go back to basically the years leading up to any given major outbreak of a disease, and you could try to spread medical knowledge that mitigated it. That's probably maybe one of the biggest ways that you could indirectly speed up human development. Since a lot of the setbacks humanity has experienced over the past couple thousand years have been related to major outbreaks of disease. You know, the Black Death, the plague, etc. You know, stuff like that. Without that, there would have been way less death and much more urbanization, economic activity, etc. Everything would have just happened much faster. But the trouble there is that you still would have had wars and stuff, you know, so. But at least would have helped. Yeah, that's maybe the only small thing I could think of. Because I'm kind of assuming that you can remember a lot of things, but the reality is that if I personally went back in time, I wouldn't be able to remember shit. I have a terrible memory. I'd go back and be like, I have this perfect plan to improve human development for the next 1,000-some years, but I totally forgot all of it, so I'm sorry.
Well, if you want to see an anime about someone who remembered all of it, watch Dr. Stone.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that. It's on my to-watch list. Let's see. Yeah, I would say medical knowledge before a major outbreak. You know, let's say the Black Death. That, I guess that would be my answer. That would probably be the best, because you don't have to remember too much about germ theory to warn people about that. Mm-hmm. You know, that's basically just get rid of the rats, be sanitary, you know, wash your hands. You know, that kind of stuff is easy to remember. I could probably do that. So I guess that's what I would go with. Let's see, maybe questions for next week. Comment about the assassination attempt on Evo Morales. Wait, was that the coup attempt, or was that a more recent thing? I don't remember a recent assassination attempt. Yeah, maybe that is a question for next time. Oh, this just happened. Okay. Yeah, I haven't read about this yet. Yeah, the story is just a couple hours ago, a couple hours old. Yeah, we'll definitely talk about that next time then, once I've had a chance to dig into it. Comment about Uruguay's elections. I haven't read too much about them. I think the article I read the other day said that probably the conservatives were going to win. They're kind of tipped to win. Yeah, I think the left-wing candidate actually won the most votes in the first round of the election, but they're going to go to a runoff, and from what I read, the different conservative candidates are going to pool their votes, and apparently it's expected that they'll have enough. to get a conservative candidate into office. But I don't know enough about Uruguayan politics to know what any of that actually means as far as implications for Uruguayan policy. I think the last time I read about Uruguayan politics, like the major issue in Uruguay was crime. There had apparently been like a big uptick. And so people were very upset about it and voted for a conservative president. But I haven't seen or heard like any follow-up to that. Uruguay has been like out of the news. It's been crowded out by some of the more dramatic stuff happening around the world. So I would lean on, either Dagnip or maybe one of our other Latin American viewers to maybe comment on that. I'm sure they would know more than I. I would point out that Uruguay has a history in its foreign policy of neutrality. So as far as that goes, I don't think, regardless of who wins, there will be much change in terms of Uruguay's involvement in international affairs. They've been very quiet and neutral as far as all the shit going on around the world recently. Let's see, that's all we had for questions. I did want to briefly talk about the presidential election coming up in the US. I'm not looking forward to it. Nobody knows what's going to happen. Previous elections have always been kind of exciting because, maybe there's a change in power, maybe there's not, but it's never something I was like worried about per se. But the last two presidential elections, I've kind of been going in with some anxiety. Well, this election and then the 2020 election. Those have been like anxious ones. So I don't particularly appreciate what that implies for the health of American political culture. Hopefully that ends sooner rather than later, but we'll see. But as far as like who's likely to win, right? Projections and whatnot. So, if you, have you looked at like the electoral math, Neuro?
I have not.
Okay, so I'm going to try to break it down for you according to what I read, just so you can have kind of like a quick guide to election day. And I will do that if I can find it in my notes. What did I write? Pennsylvania. No. Okay, it's in the other file. Okay, so basically, most of the states in the U.S. are projected to go either Dem or Republican. And, everybody knows, like, Louisiana is going to vote for Trump. Alabama is going to vote for Trump. New York is going to vote for Harris. So, assuming all of that goes according to plan, we have a pretty good idea of how many electoral votes Trump and Harris are going to end up with. So, as everybody knows, it's going to come down to the battleground states. And I'm not going to include North Carolina or Georgia. Both of them are closer than the other states that are not considered battleground states. But that said, both of them have polled consistently in favor of Trump. And so the expectation right now is that both Georgia and North Carolina will vote for Trump. So if we assume that to be true, and it's not necessarily, the North Carolina race in particular has gotten closer, especially since the Robinson bullshit. The Nazi porn thing always makes me laugh. But in all likelihood, it'll be Trump. So let's assume that. Let's assume Georgia and North Carolina go Trump. So what does that mean for the battleground states? Who has to win what in order for things to kind of pan out? So the most important one is Pennsylvania. And to put it bluntly, if Trump wins Pennsylvania, he wins the election, like flat out. Like there's no combination of wins that Harris could have amongst the other battleground states that would result in her being able to overcome losing Pennsylvania. So if Trump wins Pennsylvania, immediate win for Trump. That's it. None of the other shit matters. So let's assume that Harris wins Pennsylvania and avoids like the sudden death outcome. So that leaves the next most important states are Michigan and Wisconsin. So between Michigan and Wisconsin, if either candidate wins both, they immediately win the election. At that point, none of the remaining battleground states matters. So if Harris wins both Michigan and Wisconsin, she wins, and then vice versa if Trump wins. So what happens if there's a split? So what happens if Trump wins one and Harris wins the other? So at that point, it gets a little more complicated. At that point, it basically comes down to Arizona and Nevada But Trump at that point actually has more pathways to victory than Harris does. So basically, if Trump wins Michigan but loses Wisconsin, he can win either by winning Nevada or Arizona. He doesn't have to win both at that point. For Harris, if she wins Michigan, Trump can still win if he wins Nevada. I'm doing this from memory, so I'm trying to get this right. Arizona basically is the one that Harris would have to win if she wins Michigan. Yeah, I hope I'm getting that right. Let me actually look at it because I did have it written down. But basically, Arizona and Nevada is what it'll come down to at that point if it's split Michigan, Wisconsin. Oh, there it is. Okay. Oh, I should mention this too. If Michigan and Wisconsin are split, then whoever wins both Nevada and Arizona immediately wins. That's all they would need. But if there's a split between Nevada and Arizona, they only need to win one if they win Michigan. For the Democrats, if they win Michigan and Arizona, then they could win. Those are about the only outcomes for them at that point. So that's basically the way it breaks down. And like I said, Trump kind of has the edge here. You know, again, winning Pennsylvania means he wins immediately. And then after that, it kind of comes down to Michigan, Wisconsin. And then if that splits, which is entirely within the realm of possibility, then out of the 8 possible permutations of the Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona split, Trump wins in 5 out of the 8 of those, and Harris in only 3. So there is, statistically speaking, a kind of built-in advantage for Trump here. So he has kind of the advantage going into the election. That said, the Democratic Party has been going out of their way to try to pull voters from the traditional Republican coalition, specifically from the center, you know, moderate Republicans who are not entirely comfortable with Trump. We've talked ad nauseum about this and how the Democrats are trying to build a big tent coalition that includes moderates as well as traditional left-wing elements. And then Trump is responding by kind of doubling down on his core base. So it could be that the Democratic plan here, even as, you know, the polling has kind of evened out just ahead of the election, it could be that their strategic focus on moderate Republicans and especially women in suburbs could be enough to swing the election in their favor. Because they've actually been hemorrhaging some voters in the working class to Trump. Obviously, that's one of the big reasons Trump won in 2016. But even as they've lost a lot of those voters, and will probably lose more since they're more concerned about, you know, inflation and whatnot, and that's not something that's been satisfied to their satisfaction. But it could be that they make up the lost ground there with moderates and suburbs. That's been the Democratic game plan. And the trouble right now is that it's really difficult to tell with polling as it is right now whose strategy is really working the best. And so at the moment, it really does just look like a coin flip outcome. Like it's really just going to come down to election day, and it might even be so close that we won't know for another week after election night, like what happened in 2020, which I especially am not looking forward to. Mm-hmm. That was a really nerve-wracking week for everybody in the United States. But that's what it comes down to, just to kind of give you an idea. Like assuming all of the states vote as predicted, the battleground state hierarchy comes down to 1 on the top, Pennsylvania. That's the most important one. Harris can't win without it, and Harris wins immediately with it. If Harris wins Pennsylvania, the next tier is Michigan, Wisconsin. Whoever wins both wins immediately. And then if there's a split, then you get to the 3rd tier of battleground states, and that's Nevada, Arizona. And then the math gets a little more complicated. But basically, Trump kind of has the edge there, depending on outcome. So that's just to make things simple, because, you know, on election night, there's going to be a bunch of information that's thrown at people. So I'm just putting this forward to make it as simple as possible, basically. You know, this is what you can focus on if you just want the bare bones Cliff Notes version of how to follow the election outcome.
And then anyone who's in a state that you did not mention is not a battleground state, so it's pretty much assured to vote in its
Pretty much, yeah.
traditional direction.
Yeah, I mean, Texas is going to vote for Trump. I don't think that surprises anybody. So yeah, that most states are not battleground states where the outcome is uncertain. It's pretty clear cut.
Mm-hmm.
Like California, for example, will vote for Harris for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, the only ambiguous cases of non-battleground states is North Carolina and Georgia. They're closer, so it's possible that the outcomes could be different there. But they've still been polling consistently for Trump. So I think all of the analysts I've read have just assumed implicitly that they'll go Trump. It's also worth mentioning that there could be some weirdness depending on Nebraska and Maine's floating electors. Basically, they have a system where instead of having all of their electoral votes go towards one candidate, the one that wins the popular vote in the state, they actually have a couple of their electoral votes that are assigned to whoever wins a given congressional district. So Maine has 2 congressional districts, so 2 of their electoral votes are actually decided based on who wins those, rather than who wins the statewide popular vote. And then Nebraska has 3 congressional districts, so they have 3 electoral votes that could actually go differently than the popular vote in the state. So there was one particular combination of battleground state outcomes that could result in a tie in electoral votes between Harris and Trump, in which case the outcome of the election would be thrown over to the House of Representatives and the Congress in Washington. And that outcome is only possible if, basically, Trump gets more electoral votes from those floating electorals than expected right now. Because generally, Nebraska is a conservative state, but they have one relatively left-leaning congressional district that could generally vote left. And then Maine is more of a left-leaning state, but they have one congressional district that more consistently votes right. So they generally negate each other. But if Trump picks up an additional one of those sort of floating congressional district electoral votes, and the permutation of battleground state outcomes is just so, then both candidates would have exactly 169 electoral votes, and there would be a tie, which would be the first time that's ever happened. But given how close the election is, that can't really be ruled out.
Dude, people would be pissed if it was a tie and then Congress decided and it wasn't them, but even so, the Electoral College is still deciding for us.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and the House of Representatives is controlled by the GOP right now, so presumably at that point, Trump would win.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's the first time in my lifetime, as at least to my recollection, that any of those weird electoral votes in either Maine or Nebraska has been relevant.
Mm-hmm.
I've learned more about them in the past month than I have over my entire life. So that's just kind of how tight the election is right now. So hopefully that primer is of some utility to somebody. I just wanted to throw that out there. I mostly did it for me, but I took notes on it, and I thought I'd share it.
Chat says hard to say with this GOP. Yeah, we have a interesting setup where it feels like the Trumpian style of politics is kind of clashing with the establishment conservative one. And it's sort of like the establishment conservatives are grumpily going along with Trump's time. If he wins, it'll be his second and final term. If he loses, he could run again, even older than before.
Hypothetically, yeah. Yeah, the trouble there is that more and more of the establishment Republican elite has been kind of supplanted by more Trumpian type Republican politicians.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how much longer that institutional resistance is going to last. That remains to be seen, and that's one of the big open questions in American politics right now. Let's see. But yeah, that's pretty much all I had for this week.
Cool. Well, we can wrap it up when I'm done with this match.
Fair enough. I can talk about Netflix. I renewed my subscription recently.
Okay.
What did I do? I caught up on Stranger Things. Saw season 3 finally.
Mm-hmm.
And what did I watch? Oh, Godzilla -1. I think we talked about that before.
Yeah, you said you liked that.
Yeah, it's pretty good. I think I watched something else too, but I think I already forgot what it was. Doesn't say much for my memory. Yeah, I was gonna try to watch Decoupled, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. It's like a satire from India.
Mm-hmm.
It's a satirist that I follow on Twitter actually got hired to write a show, and it ended up on Netflix. So I've been looking forward to watching that for several years now. Just haven't gotten around to it yet.
Cool. I'm watching through Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood with my girlfriend.
Oh, yeah. What does she think? Or what do you think?
Well, I've seen it before. It's my favorite
okay.
anime.
Gotcha.
I didn't really describe it in great detail when I recommended we watch it. It's pretty heavy and multifaceted and intense with the subject material of like entire countries being sacrificed for soul power and stuff. It's pretty wild, but the character development is really, really good. I think it's one of the shows of everything that I've seen that has a lot of characters that have depth to them and sometimes can change in their alignment over the course of the story based on who they interact with and what they learn as they go.
Gotcha.
So, really great show. Highly recommend.
I forgot which of the two of you recommended it to the other and hadn't seen it before.
Oh yeah, my recommendation.
Okay, so what did she think then? The original question.
We're not quite through it yet, but she's been enjoying it a lot. Wants to know what's
cool.
going to happen. Yeah, the mystery is fun, and the fighting / magic system is really cool with the alchemy and different ways you could hone that.
Gotcha. Oh, you know what it was I watched? It was Matrix Resurrections. Finally got around to watching it. Kind of a weird experience. I don't think I've ever seen a movie that so much resented its own existence.
Was that the remake Matrix one? The reboot?
No, that was the most recent movie that was released a couple years ago. It's the sequel. Or a sequel. It's the fourth movie in the franchise.
Yeah. Huh. So it didn't like itself. Well, they didn't have Morpheus, or at least the same Morpheus, right?
Correct. Yeah, they didn't get the actor. It's got conflicting schedules or something.
Huh.
Yeah, and one of the Wachowski sisters now, one of the Wachowski sisters didn't want to participate, so it was actually just one of them. And apparently the only reason she wanted to do it is because I think one of their parents had died recently, and so she was kind of grieving and thought it might help with the grieving process.
Interesting.
But yeah, even in the movie, they kind of have this weird setup where Neo doesn't remember anything, or at least doesn't remember much. And what he does remember is kind of framed as a video game that he's designing, or has designed, and that is enormously successful. And so they have a whole pitch meeting at one point where they talk about making a sequel, and they talk about how unnecessary a sequel would be, and what the elements from the original game that they should use in the sequel would be. And the whole thing is just meta commentary. It was pretty funny. You kind of got the impression that like even the director didn't think that there was a need for a sequel, but since we're going to do it anyway, here's what we're going to do.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't watch it yet because it kind of felt like they wrapped things up in the previous one, even to the point that they kind of went past where the material or the universe felt believable and good. I really liked the first movie the most.
Oh yeah.
Because it felt like everything within the system seemed consistent. Neo was not a magical entity. He was basically just a god gamer, which was pretty cool. Like really cool that he could manipulate reality in such a way because it was digital and because the interface between your brain and the system lets you kind of use these tricks and stuff. I thought that was really cool. And then when it flips to like, no, he actually has magic too. It's like, okay, What's that? It's not really that well explained.
Gotcha. Have you watched The Animatrix yet?
I have not.
Definitely give that a try when you have the time. You'll like it. Much more so than the sequel movies. Huh. I can say that with confidence now, because now I've seen them all. I saw the fourth one. And The Animatrix is definitely better. God, my to-do list is ridiculous.
So say we all...
Have you ever seen 12 Monkeys?
I've heard of it. I don't think I've seen it.
Oh, definitely a strong recommend there. Classic sci-fi movie. What about Dark City?
Dark City I have seen.
Awesome.
That one's like really rare movie. Most people haven't heard of it.
I saw it in theaters when it came out way back in the day, and it's been one of my favorites ever since.
Interesting.
Always really liked it. Still haven't seen Fight Club, but I did see the last 10 minutes.
How?
It's just channel surfing when I was a kid.
Huh.
Just kind of moving around, and then I kind of settled on something that I thought was interesting and didn't realize that it was like the end of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, oh, that's Fight Club. I bet that would have been really interesting if I'd seen the rest of the movie. I kind of had to make a decision about what streaming service to get, because I wasn't going to pay for all of them.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to kind of prioritize stuff. Godzilla Minus One is the main reason Netflix won out. Old Godzilla fan, so I kind of felt obligated.
Nice. Godzilla is very cool. I'll have to see -1. But yeah, Dark City was pretty interesting and spooky and weird, but good. Why was it not more popular?
It was a weird movie for one. Weird sci-fi movies tend to be remembered fondly amongst the sci-fi community, but the broader market generally doesn't have too much of a taste for them. The Matrix was cool and edgy, right? So it had broader appeal, but Dark City didn't do that.
Well, Matrix was also an action movie.
Yeah.
Which I don't know if this is quite the same.
Yeah, Dark City was more of like maybe a thriller at most. Almost like a mystery. Yeah, it definitely had slower pace than Matrix.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's too bad. It deserves more attention than it's gotten. Even Roger Ebert liked it. Gave it 2 thumbs up. It's one of the few times that he gave a movie 2 thumbs up that I actually liked.
Yeah, just looking at the trailer, you can tell it's very avant-garde. Huh. Dark City. I'm going to see Venom tomorrow with the lady.
Ah.
Venom 3.
Was the third one?
Yes.
Really?
Yes, the second one was with Carnage.
Oh, okay.
The first one is introducing characters, second one's Carnage. I didn't see too many trailers of the third one. But it's called The Last Dance. I don't know if Venom's going to jump into someone else, like into a different actor.
Could be.
I like Venom, though. He's a cool character.
Oh, you like the character?
Mm-hmm. Just the interplay between the two entities, where the parasite and the host kind of end up working together. Character archetypes like that I generally like, I think. Just to see the cooperation and the differences in motivation and how they kind of wrestle for one's end. In Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, greed is in a couple different entities over the course of the show. So seeing how he interacts with the host soul and whether they become friends or not is kind of an interesting thing to see develop. Did you see Blade Runner 2049?
I have not seen it yet.
That's a good one. I like that one a lot. It looks very visually crisp, like probably the the most crisp cyberpunk future that I've seen. It's definitely dystopian and fucked up in how the world is, but it looks good and it definitely captures a good vibe. And it doesn't feel overly rushed, like it lets you enjoy the environment, so the tone is set pretty nicely. That's one of the movies that I'll just put on if I'm taking a flight somewhere and I think I might nod off, so I don't want to watch a new movie, but I'll watch something that's like kind of good, and if I doze off, I won't be upset, but it looks good. It's between that and Ready Player One. I'll put those ones on. Well, cool. We are out of our ZVT, and it's been a nice discussion. If we have any questions that we didn't get to, feel free to leave us one in the YouTube comments, and we will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.